The auctioneer's gavel came down on a number so small the crowd laughed before it finished falling, and a woman named Della Voss stood at the back of the courthouse steps with $400 folded in her coat and the deed to 65 acres nobody else would touch. She did not laugh with them. She was looking past their shoulders at a hillside of cedar, so thick and dark it seemed the land itself had been swallowed, and she was thinking, in the plain arithmetic that governed her days, that $400 was every cent she owned in the world, and that she had just spent it on ground the county called worthless. What she did not yet know was that beneath all that green ruin lay a stone box full of water older than the town, and that the very animals folks mocked her for keeping would be the ones to uncover it. But that is the end of the tale, and a tale ought to be told from its beginning. 2 springs earlier, Della had come into that dry corner of the hill country with nothing but a wagon, 11 goats, and a name that carried no weight anywhere. She was 29 years old, widowed young and left with less than nothing, for her late husband had owed money to men who came collecting. She had walked away from that with the goats because no creditor wanted a goat, and a goat, she had learned, could live on ground that would starve a cow. The town was called Pardee, and Pardee did not think much of a woman alone with a string of goats and no man to speak for her. There is a particular kind of pity a hard place saves for a woman it has decided cannot succeed, and Della drank a great deal of that pity, in her first year, poured out with false sweetness over the counter of the general store and behind her back at the church door. A young woman alone, they said, could not run a place. She had no place yet to run. She rented a lean-to and a scrap of pasture from a man named Ott Frayne, and she paid him in cheese and in labor, and she watched. That was the thing about Della that the town missed entirely. She watched. She watched how the water ran and where it did not. She watched which slopes greened first in spring and which stayed brown. She watched the goats most of all, for a goat will tell you things about land if you have the patience to read it, and Della had nothing but patience, patience being the one thing poverty gives you in abundance. And in the second spring, when the county announced it would auction off the tax-forfeited parcels nobody had paid on in years, Della went to the courthouse with her whole fortune in her coat, because among those parcels was the old Kessler place, 65 acres choked with cedar. And she believed she knew a thing about it that no one else had bothered to learn. There was one man in Pardee who did not laugh at her, and his name was Emil Sorensen. He was old and bent as a fence post, and he had come from the old country as a young man, from a place where the land was cold and stubborn and taught a person to be the same. He kept a few sheep on a rocky slope everyone else had given up on, and he made it feed them, and folks called him queer for it and left him alone. Emil had watched Della the way she watched the land, and he had seen something in her that he recognized. On the evening after the auction, he came up the road, leaning on his stick, and found her sitting on the tailgate of her wagon, looking at her new deed, as though it might change if she stared hard enough. "Land is not worth what a man pays for it," he told her, in that slow accent that turned every word over twice before setting it down. "Land is worth what a body can make it do, and that cedar hill. Everybody see the cedar. Nobody ask what the cedar is drinking." Della looked up at him. Then, because that was the very thought that had walked her to the courthouse. "Cedar drinks deep," she said. "A slope that thick with it has to have water under it, or the trees would never have taken hold that heavy." Emil nodded slow, the way a man nods when a younger person has arrived at a truth he already carried. "Water," he said. "Under all that green, there is water. Girl, and water in a dry country is worth more than gold, because gold you cannot drink and gold will not grow a garden. But the cedar will not let you reach it. Cedar is a jealous tree. It takes the ground and it holds it and it drinks it dry and lets nothing else live. You cannot cut 65 acres alone with an axe." She looked at him, and then she looked out at her string of goats, browsing in the failing light, tearing at brush the way goats do, stripping a thorn branch bare in the time it took a cow to decide it was hungry. "I will not use an axe," she said. And Emil Sorensen laughed, but it was not the town's laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just watched someone open a door he thought was painted shut. The work began the next morning, and the work was slow, and the work was of a kind the town had never seen and would not have believed if they had. Della did not attack the cedar hill. She fenced it, foot by careful foot, with wire and with cedar posts cut from the very trees she meant to be rid of, running a paddock along the lowest edge where the slope leveled into a hollow. Then she turned her goats into it and let them do what goats do best, which is to eat the world down to its bones. They went at the cedar with a hunger that looked almost like spite, standing on their hind legs to reach the low green, stripping bark in long ribbons, girdling the younger trees so they would die standing and dry out for easy pulling. A goat will not fell a grown cedar, but a goat will kill it slow, and 11 goats, working a fenced patch, will clear the understory in a season and leave the big trees naked and doomed above bare ground. Della moved the fence as they finished, a new paddock every few weeks, a patient march up the choked hillside, and behind them the goats left ground that had not seen sunlight in 40 years. She rose before light every day of it. She dug post holes until her hands went rough as bark and split at the knuckles and healed rough again. She hauled water up from Aunt Frane's well in barrels on the wagon, because her own land, for all Emil's certainty, had shown her not one drop of it yet. And there were nights she lay in the lean-to counting the arithmetic of it in the dark. 400 spent, 11 goats become 18 with the spring kids. Cheese to sell, but Pardee bought little and paid less. If the water was not there, she had spent her whole life on a green grave. She did not let herself despair. Despair, she had learned, changes nothing, while adjustment changes everything. She would find another way to make the cleared ground pay, even without the water, she told herself, and she banked her fear low, like a coal under ash, and rose again before light. The town, of course, had opinions. They saw her wagon go past, loaded with barrels, and they said the fool woman was hauling water up a hill to grow nothing on. They saw the goats climbing the dead cedar like devils, and they said she had lost her mind out there alone, which is a thing a town says easily about a woman it does not understand. At the store, a rancher named Colton Beeler, who ran cattle on a big spread east of town and fancied himself the measure of a serious man, made a habit of asking her loudly how the goat farm was coming along, drawing out the word goat so the whole store could enjoy it. "You'd have done better," he told her once, "to sleep in the street with your $400 than sink it in that cedar swamp. At least the street's flat." The men laughed. Della paid for her flour and her wire and her nails, and she looked at him with a stillness that was worse than any answer, because it gave him nothing to push against, and she carried her goods out to the wagon and drove home to her hill. It is easier to believe a thing is worthless than to admit you were wrong to mock the one who saw its worth, and Pardee had committed itself early to the belief that Della Voss was a fool. A town does not like to give up a verdict it has grown comfortable with, so they held to it, and they watched her clear her impossible acres, one goat bite at a time, and they waited, most of them, for the satisfaction of watching her fail. She did not fail. By the second summer of the work, the lower third of the hill lay open to the sky, the dead cedars pulled and stacked and drying into the finest fence posts and firewood a person could ask for, which Della sold quietly into the next county where nobody knew to laugh at her. And the cleared ground came up green with grass she had never planted, grass whose seed had lain sleeping under the cedar shade for half a century, waiting for the light. Her goats grew fat on it. Her herd was 30 head now, and the cheese came richer. And she found buyers for that too, further out, patient buyer by patient buyer. But it was on a morning in the third summer, working the highest paddock near the crown of the hill, where the cedar had grown thickest and darkest of all, that Della found the thing Emil had promised. The goats had cleared a hollow up there, a low sunken place ringed by the biggest cedars on the whole property, and where they had eaten it bare and torn the roots and turned the soil with their sharp hooves, the ground had gone dark and soft, and in the middle of it, half swallowed by earth and root, sat a shape too square to be natural. Della knelt in the mud with her hands and dug. and her fingers found cut stone, dressed stone, laid stone, corners and edges made by human hands, and cold water seeping up cold and clear between them. It was a spring box. Someone, long before the Kesslers, long before Pardee had a name, had found a living spring on that hilltop and built a box of quarried stone to hold it. And then the cedar had come and buried it, and buried the memory of it, until a widow's goats ate the forgetting away. She did not tell a soul, not that first day. She knelt there in the mud with her hands in the cold water, and she felt her own heart going like a hammer, and old Emil's words came back to her. Water in a dry country is worth more than gold, and she banked the coal of it low under the ash of her plain face and told no one. She cleaned the box out over the following weeks, hauling out the muck and the roots by lantern light after her day's labor was done, and she found it was fed from below by a steady flow that did not slacken even as the summer went dry and mean. A flow that filled the stone box to its lip and ran off in a clear thread down the cleared slope where her grass grew greenest. She built a pipe of hollowed cedar and a second stone trough below it so her goats could water without fouling the source. And she did the arithmetic again in the dark, but it was a different arithmetic now. 65 acres. A living spring that did not fail. Cleared pasture where the town swore nothing would grow. She was not counting her way toward a green grave anymore. She was counting her way towards something she did not yet have a word for, and the word, though she would not have said it aloud, was rich. Emil came up the hill one evening, and she showed him, and the old man stood over the stone box a long while and said nothing, and then he took off his hat, which she had never seen him do for any living thing, and he said, "This water was here before your people and before mine, and it waited for someone patient enough to earn it. You are that one." And he put his hat back on and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended it was the wind. Then came the summer that broke the country. It came in dry, and it stayed dry. The sky a hard clean blue, day after day after day, no cloud to shade the sun that flattened the grass and cracked the clay and pulled the creeks down to strings of muddy pools, and then to nothing at all. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The Pardee wells sank low, and then sucked air. Colton Beeler's fine cattle, hundreds of head that had made him the measure of a serious man, began to gaunt and stumble, milling around dry stock ponds that had become basins of split mud. The ranchers hauled water at ruinous cost from the county seat until the roads themselves seemed to bake, and then they could not haul enough, and the cattle began to die, and the smell of it hung over the valley. Hunger changes a town, and so does thirst, and thirst changes it faster. The pity Pardee had saved for Della curdled into something else when word got around, as word does that the fool woman on the Cedar Hill had water. Not a well going brackish and low like everyone else's. A spring, a cold living spring that did not fail, up on the ground they had all called worthless, running clear while their own stock dropped in the dust. It is a bitter thing to watch your fortune fail and your neighbor's rise, and it is more bitter still when that neighbor is the one you laughed at. Some of Pardee could not forgive her for it, and one of them was Colton Beeler, who came up her road in a fine buggy with his hat in his hand, and false warmth painted over his desperation like whitewash over rot. He found her at the stone box, and he stood looking at that clear water running while his cattle died 6 miles away, and Della watched him do the arithmetic behind his eyes. "My dear Della," he said, and the word dear cost him something to say, "I've come to make you an offer, one neighbor to another, for I'll not see a young woman alone struggle with a thing too big for her. That spring is a fine little seep, more than a body like you can rightly use. I'll buy the whole place off you, generous, more than you paid, and you can take your goat somewhere flat and easy and never break your back again." He named a number that was small, cruelly small, dressed up as kindness, a number that assumed she was still the frightened widow who could not count. And Della looked at him, and she was not that woman anymore, and she said plainly, "No." His face changed, then, the whitewash cracking. He talked of how a woman couldn't hold land that others meant to have, of neighbors who might not stay so neighborly, of how alone she was up here, and every word was a threat, wearing kindness like a coat. Then he made his mistake, the way greedy men always do, for he leaned in and said, "You can't fight the whole town alone, Della. One person alone, against all of Pardee." And that was the wrong thing to say to her, because it named the very lie she had lived under for 3 long years, and it showed her the answer, whole and clear. She would not be one person alone against the town. She would bind the town to her instead. The next morning, Della drove down into Pardee, and she did not go to the men who ran it. She went to the women at the church door, and the families with children going hollow-cheeked, and the small holders whose few animals were dying same as the big ranchers. And she told them plainly that there was water on her hill, and that any family in Pardee who needed it could come and take it, free, as much as their stock could drink and their barrels could carry, for as long as the drought held. She would not sell it, and she would not sell the land it lay under, but she would share the water, because water in a dry country belonged, she said, to whoever was thirsty, and they came. They came in wagons and on foot, with every barrel and bucket they owned. Up the road they had mocked her on, into the cleared acres they had called a green grave. And they filled their vessels at the second stone trough Della had built below the bog. And the cold, clear water saved their milk cows and their workhorses and their gardens and their children through the worst of it. Colton Beeler came too, at the last, when his pride finally starved thinner than his cattle, and Della let him fill his barrels the same as everyone, and charged him nothing, and that costless generosity shamed him more thoroughly than any price she could have named. 4. It is a hard thing to threaten a person who has just handed you your life for free, and harder still, to keep your neighbor's respect once they have seen you try to buy that person's ruin cheap while she was busy saving them. The drought broke that autumn, as droughts do, and Pardee did not forget. A town that has held a wrong verdict a long time can be slow to overturn it, but water changes minds faster than argument ever could, and Pardee had drunk from Della Voss's hill for a season and lived. The pity was gone from the store counter and the false sweetness with it, replaced by a plainer thing, respect, which is the only kind of regard worth having and the only kind that has to be earned. They bought her cedar posts now and her rich cheese, at fair prices, glad to. The families who had watered their stock on her hill sent their sons and daughters up to help her clear the last dark acres, and a boy named Wick Frayne, old Ott's youngest, took to the goats in the spring box as though he had been born for them, and Della, who had carried her whole life alone, found she did not mind the company on the hill, and taught him what Emil had taught her. Colton Beeler sold off what was left of his gaunted herd and left the county quiet, and nobody in Pardee spoke his name with much warmth after. For a town remembers who came with a hand out and who came with a hand closing. Emil Sorensen lived to see the whole 65 acres cleared and green and running with clear water, and he sat one last spring evening by the stone box that was older than his people and hers, and he said to her, "I told you, girl, land is worth what a body can make it do, and you made it do this." Della Voss stood on the crown of her hill in the failing light, and below her the cleared acres ran green and gold down to the trough where the neighbor's cattle drank beside her fat goats, and the cold living water rose steady from the stone box her animals had uncovered, filling to the lip and running over, as it had before the town had a name and would long after she had paid $400 for ground the county called worthless, and everyone had laughed. And the laughing was long over now, drunk, dry, and forgotten, like the water that had waited patient in the dark for someone stubborn enough to earn it.